told I've got 45 minutes, and this is about a 4-hour talk, so somebody might have to heckle or get a hook, because it's really a big subject. But when we first converted to organic, it was because we weren't making a living conventionally. In fact, I wasn't motivated by the idea that organic was the right thing to do. I was motivated by wanting to be able to pay the mortgage and have a decent standard of living and have our kids be able to grow up on a farm that they could take over and see a future in. Now, partway through that process, I'll digress for a minute. I was at a talk recently where somebody said either we win or we learn when it came to starting something. And when we started on this venture of going organic, I really wasn't interested in learning as much as I had to learn. So obviously we made a lot of mistakes, but the process of going to organic started with looking for markets. We had about 600 acres, and we were growing corn and soybeans and farming the government, which we didn't feel real good about. But I went through something that I've shared with some people, and I wonder how many of you can identify with this. And this goes back to before Roundup. But every year when I was spraying, I couldn't wait to get done because I felt sicker and weaker every day that I was operating that sprayer. And I had a lot of neighbors that I talked to, and we compared notes, and everybody had that same issue. And I can describe to you the last day I sprayed an herbicide. I was using 2,4-D and Prowl and atrazine, and it was a real witch's brew of stuff, but it was needed, quote unquote, to kill the weeds that I was dealing with. And I went to fold up the boom, and my right arm wouldn't move. And I spent that summer paralyzed on the right side. Now that put us into an ethical dilemma, because I had to decide if I could honestly hire somebody to do a job that I felt might kill me. And incidentally, my father died of cancer and told me the last 10 years of his life that they told us this stuff was safe, and they lied, and it's going to kill me. And he knew. So that actually created the need to learn very rapidly. We'd already been exploring the markets. We thought we'd get our feet wet very slowly, try a few acres, do the transition. Now we were faced with this problem of, do we keep farming? And we made the decision to go cold turkey organic. Excuse me, that was the last day that I ever sprayed anything on our farm. And it forced us to study, because at that time I went to the experts, and this is back a ways, and they told us that, well, organic is a good system if you've got a market garden, but it's really a ridiculous idea if you've got any kind of acreage or want to do it on any scale. It's totally impractical. And then I found that there had been some organic farmers who were already growing field crops on a pretty big scale. I didn't know they were organic because their crops looked really good. And I bugged them for information. Now, at that time, there were not enough markets. There was a great market for soybeans for export to the Pacific Rim, but they were selling a lot of their other crops on the conventional market because nobody wanted them. These farmers did something that to a conventional farmer like myself seemed stupid. They shared the knowledge they had, and they shared where their markets were. They didn't have enough, and yet they gave away something that they were short of. And I learned a new lesson in economics from them. By the end of that year, we did not have enough to fill the demand. We had demand for everything we were growing. They had demand for everything they were growing. So it seemed like the more they gave away, the more we all had. The rising tide raises all boats. And what we really gained in the organic market was the ability to sell profitably crops other than corn and soybeans, where we were dependent on the government program actually to make any money. So this was a really terrifying time, because we had just given up these things that I had spent my life learning we had to have in order to farm. The chemical fertilizers and the chemicals that we had gotten used to taught me something that I wasn't aware of. They put me into a thought process, a way of thinking, a way of looking at problems. And I don't know if you probably all have heard of Joel Salatin, but he once pointedly told me, when the only tool you got's a hammer, every problem looks like a nail to you. Well, we only had one tool, and we had to quickly find other tools to manage our farm. So I had an in at the Cornell Library, at the old, and you have a library like this here, an old archive. My wife worked for Cornell, and she knew how to maneuver through the stacks, and we decided that we were going to spend that year getting ready for the next season, figuring out how to find something, machines to replace our herbicides, and how to find fertilizers that could replace the fertilizers we've been using, because that was the mindset that I was in. That was where probably a lot of us come to when we think about farming organically. How do we substitute something for this input, and how do we substitute something for that input? That was a really bad way to look at it. I was asking absolutely the wrong questions. In fact, I learned something from one of my consulting clients. He was a big wheel on Wall Street, not a nice guy at all, but he was brilliant. And when I started working for him, he said, the first thing you have to do is frame the right question. Because he said, if you're asking the wrong question, you're never going to get the right answer. That seemed kind of duh, but we'll come back to that, or we'll see how that affects how we went forward. The other quote that really stayed with me was from William Albrecht. And William Albrecht used to tell his students, see what you're looking at. Which, another one that sounds duh, but when we really see what we're looking at, we have to go down several layers. So I'll give you an example. When the idiot light comes on in the dashboard of your car, do we see the problem as the light? Or do we see the problem as the reason the light came on? I think when we were farming conventionally, the way I learned how to farm, when I saw that light, I saw that light being on as the problem. Oh, we could put tape over it. We could unhook the wire from it. If that's the question we're asking, is how do I make that light go out, we could get all kinds of wrong answers. And we had been working on our farm asking, how do we make the light go out whenever nature was telling us that there was a problem. So when we had a weed problem, for instance, I saw the problem as, and framed the question as, how do I kill this weed? That was the wrong question, and I was getting the wrong answer. That's when I went to the Cornell Library, I was coming with that question. What I found there turned my thinking upside down. I found an old German manuscript written by a professor whose name was Bernhard Rademacher. And he was the guru of weeds in Europe. He was the first guy that I've ever read about that experimented with herbicides. In fact, he did a lot of the groundbreaking work on herbicides. He did a lot of work on weeders and on mechanical weed control. And he must have been one tough teacher, because his graduate students took forever to get their degrees. But he wrote in this manuscript, cultural practices form the basis of all weed control, while the various other means should be regarded as auxiliary only. Now that confused me a little. Here's the guy that discovered using, or one of the people pioneered using herbicides, and he said, this is not weed control. And the question I came away from that paper with was, how do I understand what he meant by cultural practices? Cultural weed control is just the opposite of what we had been doing. What we had been doing on our farm was creating the same environment year after year, and then using a chemical selective agent to pick out just those plants that would thrive in that environment and could survive the chemical. And within a year or two, there would be a few plants that survived what we were doing, and then we had to come up with another chemical to add to the mix to take care of the problem. We were treating symptoms. All of these things that we were seeing were symptoms of an unbalanced biology. So where do we go from here? Again, the primary problem was we were young farmers trying to figure out how to pay our bills. We had markets, and I did find in his papers some weeders that worked. I did find some suggestions on fertilizer, and we kind of went at it. And we found out that going from conventional to organic, soybeans worked pretty good. We didn't take any yield hit because we had learned how to control weeds mechanically. This is still the reactive type of farming. And I found another treasure. We had a neighbor who had never learned to use chemicals. He was an old man. My father was gone. He had passed away relatively young from the cancer. This was an old friend of the family who knew how to operate cultivators. And he set about to teach me how to control weeds. Again, this is still by killing them. Took 3 years after he started teaching me how to do it before he actually said I was doing anything right. I had nothing but criticism. So this is one of those cases where you win or you learn. And I learned. So we did fairly well, and we're growing a relatively simple crop mix where we were putting in corn, followed by soybeans, followed by a winter grain that was underseeded with clover. We turned the clover under to plant corn again. Worked really nice the first couple of years. The clover grew like crazy. I'm going to digress here. We had some discussions earlier today about research on clover. We have worked very intensively at Cornell. Megan Chepansky did some of her graduate work on our farm. And we found that in terms of fixing nitrogen, medium red clover produces easily enough nitrogen to make 300 bushel corn. We've actually harvested organic corn that did 320 bushel. There was a small plot. I'd like to be able to do it again. I'll brag about it for years. But because it happened, it showed it was possible. Cornell set up a systems trial. Cornell University, who we work with, we're lucky that my wife worked there, but we're also very lucky to be only an hour away. And they were setting up an organic systems trial, and they asked farmers to advise them. Now, in that systems trial, they replicated what we were doing in the fields, but they took good, disciplined data. You know, I was getting good data too. I was observing what was happening in the fields, but they were measuring and recording. And what was interesting, their systems trial was about 4 or 5 years behind us in terms of transition. We'd gone from a chemical, simple system to something that had a little more diversity. And all of the problems that we ran into on our farm happened at the university at about the same point, only a little later. And that was a huge help, because as we encountered these situations and needed information to learn with them, we had some really solid reference, and we were able to suggest experiments for answering those questions. I know I'm don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to fast forward to this system was making us lots of money because organic prices were high. We were able to tolerate some of the problems that we had. We could tolerate having some weeds get away from us. We could tolerate having some disease because, wow, the prices were good. So we had added dry beans at about the 4th or 5th year, and we put those in the place of soybeans. And when we first grew dry beans, I thought we'd found a way to print our own money. The prices were high, the yields were phenomenal, the market was insatiable, and they really were an easy crop to grow. Until 3 years later, I put dry beans again in some of the same fields. And I figured, boy, this seed's not as good as the other seed. These beans don't have any roots on them. And they don't grow as well. And fast forward a few more years, and our yields were tanking. Now this one case is going to illustrate a bigger picture. I found a professor at Cornell. His name was Georgia Bowie. And I asked him, why are our yields tanking on the dry beans? and he had been working on this. And he was incidentally one of the people who was behind the soil health work that Cornell started doing in the 90s. He had done some real pioneering work, but the big thing is he was asking the right question. And he said, you know, when I first started as an academic, farmers would come to me and talk about a problem, and I would always start explaining to them why that problem was there, the life cycle of the pest, you know, what it was about the crop, and they always said, we don't want to hear that, just tell us what to spray on it to get rid of it. And he said, now that I'm ready to retire, somebody is finally asking me the question that I was trying to answer back when I started. So he explained to me what happened to our dry beans. And he had done extensive research. It's all published and well documented. There is a complex of fungi and there are different pathogens in the soil that attacks the dry bean roots. And just to give you a picture, some of these dry beans had stems that long and the roots literally rotted off and they had really small tops. And we had pictures from when the Native Americans grew dry beans in their Three Sisters program that they had roots that went 4 or 5 feet into the ground. Now that should have been kind of a signal as to what was going on. George looked at those root rots, also noticed that there were pathogenic nematodes. He was a nematologist as well. Those pathogenic nematodes were abrading the roots, creating an open highway for the pathogens to go into the roots. Now the question is, why is this going on? And he made a brilliant breakthrough. He asked the question of what would happen if we changed the preceding crop? And what effect does the preceding crop have on this complex of problems? So he set up a bioassay. He actually went in the greenhouse and he took soils from all different areas where he planted different cover crops and different previous crops. And he planted a very susceptible variety of dry beans. And he found that some previous crops made the problem worse. Some previous crops made the problem a lot worse. Some were neutral. Some improved it, and just a few almost eliminated the disease. That was the beginning of the solution to this particular soil health issue. And this was a big issue in New York. We had a dry bean industry that was tanking because of collapsing yields. We had a vegetable industry that was tanking because of collapsing yields. And the farmers were frustrated and really after our university because they kept saying, you need to get us better pesticides. You know, we need to have things that'll kill these problems. And they were up against the wall because nothing worked anymore. You know, these vegetable crops are kind of the canary in the coal mine. As the soil health deteriorated, they were the ones that were showing the inability to yield. And there was also a cooperative extension agent who, she is retired now, and she never got credit for any of the soil health work that you read now about the Cornell soil health test, Carol McNeil. And the farmers were coming to her with the same question. But she was paying attention and saying, you're asking the wrong question. We need to find out why this is happening to these crops. And an interesting thing about soil health, it's a lot like human health. We don't think about it until it's gone, and we can only describe it in terms of the absence of it. We really don't have good language for describing health. So this was kind of a detective story of what's going on, what's breaking down in the system. Now, George told me that if you planted yellow mustard and incorporated it just ahead of dry beans, that you would really reduce the amount of fungi in the soil, really reduce the pathogenicity of the roots. And he got me to try it. And we were looking for a place in the rotation to add this species of brassicas. And we discovered that we could do this we could frost seed yellow mustard in March in our corn stalks. That was a place where we weren't getting a cover crop. We would put manure on it, we spread the yellow mustard, and it would grow. And we don't have to plant dry beans until late June, so we had time to get a nice green growth of yellow mustard, and we would plow it in. And he came out with his graduate students that year. He was following it up, and he said, and make sure you leave half of a field undone so we can do a comparison. They came after this first year, and the mustard didn't really grow that good. I didn't know enough about it to get a really nice stand. And on a scale of 1 to 5 for root rot, what he showed was that we had an improvement, that a field where the control would have been maybe a 4 most of the way rotted off, it would take it to a 3. That was really significant. It added bushels to the final yield. Then he told me, you've got another species that would work, and that was buckwheat. Now, the way the yellow mustard worked is really interesting, and this work has continued, and there's been a lot of new discoveries that came out of it. The yellow mustard has glucosinolates. You all like the flavor of mustard? That sharpness is glucosinolate. And there's a sulfur compound. In the mustard plant, there's the glucosinolate, and then there's an enzyme that when you bruise the leaf or damage the cell, the enzyme will clip the glucosinolate and give off a gas, which is a type of cyanide. When we turned in the mustard, it was releasing this biofumigant gas, and it was killing the nematodes, and it was killing the pathogens that were attacking our roots. And Michigan State did some real advanced work on it. And they started asking the question, well, is this the same thing as chemical fumigation? And they established that when you biofumigated with mustard, you seemed to take out the pathogens, but didn't really crash the soil life, that you were leaving things behind, and that the soil life was still fairly active. So it was somewhat selective. I'm going to take this story forward, and I think in a web, so it's really hard to be linear. A little after that, I was at a conference in California, in Asilomar, and they were having trouble growing organic strawberries because you have to use methyl bromide in the Salinas Valley because they're growing strawberries on strawberries on strawberries. And somebody discovered that you could take broccoli waste and put it on these strawberry fields, plow it in, and control some of the diseases that they were having trouble with that, quote, required the use of methyl bromide. Well, that was the same thing. The glucosinolates were released, were clipped, the soil was being biofumigated, and they were able to grow good strawberries without using methyl bromide. Now, they've taken that further, and they've got a technique there now called anaerobic deinfestation, where they actually put the broccoli waste on, turn it under, cover it with plastic, and flood it so that they have anaerobic conditions. And they've actually got a treatment that works better than methyl bromide. And now that they've banned methyl bromide, the conventional world is benefiting from having a treatment that takes care of this problem in the soil. So it's interesting how some of these scientific discoveries kind of branch out, and lead to other discoveries. But we're still talking about symptoms unless we go back and understand what George was trying to explain to me. What he was telling me was that when we were rotating from dry beans to wheat that was underseeded to clover, clover was one of these crops that's not killed by these pests, but they co-host it and they multiply it. So even with the rotation we were using, we were having either neutral or crops that were co-hosts, so that it was as if we weren't rotating at all. We also had, during that time, noticed a weed that the same species was developing as a weed. Now, it wasn't because we were seeding yellow mustard, but we were starting to get wild mustard in the fields. So nature has an intelligence. We had reference to that earlier today. I think we can learn from what we see in the fields, what's going on, and nature often has the remedy for the problem. And a general principle, where I'm trying to hurry this up, that I learned was that whenever we have a problem that requires a pesticide, quote unquote requires, chemical farming or organic, when we have something that we feel needs an outside intervention, that it's not actually, the pest is not actually the problem. The pest is an indicator to us of an unbalanced biology. What we've learned since then, and this I can give you dozens of examples, is when we have one of these really difficult agronomic problems, we could usually deal with it by introducing the right new species or group of species. So that these tough agronomic problems that have us using pesticides are actually symptoms of an unbalanced biology that is asking for something added to it. Now, if you look back at our system, we were growing corn, a grass, soybeans, a legume, wheat, a grass, clover, a legume, dry beans, a legume. We only had 2 plant families. Nature was trying to introduce a third plant family by the mustard coming on. Fortunately, George had us bring that in at a time when it wasn't hurting our yields. And we noticed that by growing yellow mustard as a cover crop, the weed went away. It stopped growing as a weed. So this was nature trying to rebalance my problem. Next example of this came when we started having Canada thistle. Anyone here have issues with Canada thistle? We all love to hate this weed. And about 7, 8 years in, we started noticing more Canada thistle in the small grains part of our rotation. And it was getting worse. I found somebody who knew more about the thistle than I did. This was the same guy that taught me how to cultivate. And he told me, I'm going to show you something, and I want you to pay attention. And there was a patch right next to his house. We rented his farm at that time. He waited until the thistle was in bloom, and he cut it. Cut the grain right down with it. And he said, you'll never see thistle come back there in the next couple of years. And he was right. So what happened? And there's actually an old saying, I don't know if any of you have ever heard it, about Canada thistle. Cut it in May, it'll be back in a day. Cut it in June, it'll be back soon. Cut it in July and tell it goodbye. And the reason that saying is what it is, it only works at a certain latitude or a certain season. When the thistle has removed as much energy as it is going to from the roots are smaller. It's invested everything into reproducing, so right when they're in bloom, the roots are the smallest they're going to be. That's when you cut it. So another friend that I had mentioned that his great uncle had done work on Canada thistle in Germany at the University of Kiel, and he discovered that the thistle can only survive with an anaerobic organism on its roots in the subsoil. So there's a fungal symbiont that the thistle root system needs, that needs anaerobic conditions. Now that kind of makes sense because the thistle was growing in low spots, in wet spots, places where the soil tended to get compacted. So if we ask the right question, I'm starting to learn on this. Instead of asking, how do I kill the thistle? I started asking, what makes that thistle grow there? Well, we had compacted soil, and because those were wet spots, we would, as soon as we harvested the grain, we would be back in there and recompacted them. And we were creating the anaerobic conditions in the subsoil that the roots needed. The reason the mowing worked was that those roots were small and they were allowing air back into the ground. So that didn't quite fix the problem. You know, we learned how to treat the symptom by mowing it at that stage, but it came right back. Because those spots were wet again, we compacted them again, and we had the issue a few years later. So I thought about back to cultural weed control. And one of the practices that Dr. Laudermoff talked about was switching to a crop whose biology mismatches the life cycle of the pest. So what crops would mismatch the life cycle of the Canada thistle? And preferably one that you did some disturbance right at that stage when it's in bloom. Right where we are, winter barley is harvested exactly when the thistle starts to bloom. So we went from we were growing spelt at that time because it was a good market. I tried on the worst thistle field, let's rotate from spelt to winter barley. The winter barley was harvested late the next June, or by the first week of July. We chisel plowed, and then we planted a crop of buckwheat, and it went away. Then we found that we could also do that and put dry beans in. That was a lot more profitable. But the buckwheat was kind of nice at that stage because we were still cleaning up the root rot and the disease problem that we had that was lowering our dry bean yields. Incidentally, our dry bean yields doubled within about 3 years of changing the rotation to bring in this other biology, bring in these other species. Cornell had the same issue in their plots at exactly the same point where it hit our farm. And there's an advisory committee for the organic systems trial where we were called in and said, we've got an issue here. These perennial weeds are taking over the fields and we may have to abandon this trial if we can't figure out what to do. So I suggested what we had done on the farm. And there was a big discussion, and there were some weed ecologists there. One of them took exception to that suggestion because he said there is no way a plant that has that much reserve in the ground and is that growing that strongly is going to be hurt by that little bit of disturbance that you're doing. It's going to come right back, he predicted. Fast forward about 3 years, the report after this change was our fields are now free of perennials and we can go back to our old rotation. And I've kind of brought up, well, why would we go back to the old rotation that caused the problem? So here we've added a little more diversity. You know, we went from corn, soybeans, spelt or wheat to clover. You know, we brought in mustard to solve one problem. Now we've brought, in addition to the mustard, we've stretched the rotation. And at least in certain parts of the cycles or certain fields, we were putting barley after the wheat, and then following the barley with buckwheat, and then following the buckwheat with rye, which was underseeded to clover, and then back to the corn. Really made our weed control better. You see a progression here. Every time we have a problem, we find that by adding more complexity to the system became more resilient. And it took away some of the other problems. Now, we also had a weed that I've talked with some of the people here about when we first converted to organic, and it was on one particular farm. It was pretty fierce. Anyone here have troubles with velvet leaf? That's another weed we all love to hate. And on our farm, the velvet leaf grew taller than corn. And it was one particular farm that I started renting because nobody wanted it, and I got it cheap. The previous renter who had been renting that place came to me and he said, I heard you just rented the old Vanderhoof place. Let me tell you something about that farm. Nothing grows there. Absolutely nothing but weeds will grow on that piece of land. And there was one spot where the barnyard had been where the first year the field failed, that I ended up mowing it because there was no corn. It was all velvet leaf. We came back, tried it again. I figured I needed better machines. And that year with soybeans did a little better than corn, but I still ended up sacrificing part of the field. After about, this would be by the year 2000, we had a field day there, and we were finally able to grow the corn. You know, it still wasn't pretty, but when we had the field day there, the velvet leaf was only about 4 feet tall. And we noticed it had a lot of yellow leaves on it. And we noticed that those yellow leaves were turning black and falling off. And I called one of my friends at Cornell who taught me a lot of things. He was a weed professor, Tony DiTomasio. And I had a great idea. I said, I think I found a way to get rich. We're going to take this fungus, this disease, and be able to sell it to people to get rid of the weed. And Tony looked the whole situation over and he said, well, that's a great idea, but first you have to explain why is it killing the weeds here and not killing them on your neighbor's farm? Because it's got to work everywhere if you're going to make something out of it. See, I still had the wrong idea. I kept coming up with these ways to see the velvet leaf as a problem, try to kill the velvet leaf. About a year after that, one of the graduate students that we worked with said, hey, you've got a virus in this velvet leaf. It was called Albution yellows. And incidentally, this velvet leaf was covered with whiteflies. And the whiteflies are spreading the virus from plant to plant. And that's weakening it so that the fungus kills it quicker. So here's another, again, I thought I had found something that would take care of the problem by killing it. But again, none of these diseases or the whiteflies were killing it on conventional farms in the neighborhood. So that kind of raised the question of what's going on here. Another observation we made was when we pulled that velvet leaf, it used to be so you couldn't pull it out of the ground in the summer. It had pretty fierce roots. This velvet leaf was coming free. Had really small roots. So, and along with the velvet leaf doing that, we noticed that our lamb's quarter and pigweed, what escaped, was not nearly as vigorous. So what common trait do these three species have? Lamb's quarter, pigweed, and velvet leaf. Anyone recognize something about them? They're non-mycorrhizal weeds. Our crops are mycorrhizal plants. Most of them are. I mean, there are some exceptions. But this group of weeds that are non-mycorrhizal plants really thrive in very high fertility situations. In fact, high phosphorus is hostile to mycorrhizae. And these mycorrhizal crops were finding an environment that they were very comfortable in, that the crops were happy with. Now I'm going to give you another quote from Dr. Rademacher in his weed control paper. He said, every crop should be planted after its most suitable predecessor, so that the vigor of the crop alone checks the growth of the weeds. Just hold that one for a minute. So we've got this weed that's becoming weaker and weaker, and it's dying. What I'm pretty sure is going on, it's sort of like when you have a weak potato in a row. It's the one that's got all the potato beetles. I think these diseases and insects that are attacking my velvet leaf are opportunists. They're actually attacking the weakest and sickest plants that are in the field. The environment there is not a hospitable environment for that species. We've got this huge weed legacy effect from all the velvet leaf that had grown there over the years, but they're no longer growing in a favorable environment. So now I'm going to shift gears and make you think about what you already know. What happens when you abandon a field that's been in row crops, particularly corn, soybeans? What grows the first year? It'd be broadleaf weeds, right? Maybe a few annual grasses. Pigweed can make 900,000 seeds. Lamb's quarters can make in the hundreds of thousands. Obviously, velvet leaf makes a lot of seeds. So we might have 5 orders of magnitude more weeds in one of these fields that's abandoned, falling on the ground, than what represented the weeds that were there. What grows the second year? You see almost none of these weeds. Now, in the reductionist way of thinking that I was approaching things with, I would have assumed, wow, we got all these weeds, we're going to have more. But actually, when you think about, and we all know this, we kind of have to plug it into we have to be aware that we know this, because we've observed this kind of thing. The next year, the environment in that field was changed by the weeds that grew the year before. It's no longer the same environment. It's sort of like you never swim in the same river twice. Because what happened the year before changed the environment in that soil so that it became the most suitable environment for a different group of plants. If you let this go about 5 years, you start going to perennials, woodier plants. You start going from a bacterially dominated soil toward a fungally dominated soil. And if you let that go for 500 years, you'll be back to hardwood forest. This is nature's power of succession of species. All rotation really is a succession. If we learn how to design the rotation correctly, we can make that soil, the crop that we're growing, always be the best if we can make that crop always be the best adapted species for the environment that we left from the previous crop, we're going to have a tremendous advantage on the whole farm. Because these well-adapted plants are not as likely to get diseased, they're not as likely to have insect problems, they're going to be much more competitive with the weeds. Incidentally, I can't remember the professor's name, but he was here at Madison. This would have been 20 plus years ago. I talked about some of these observations. They weren't as advanced as they are now, but he said that he had made an observation in one of his trials that he couldn't replicate, where he was looking at the effect of the mycorrhizae growing on the crop roots, what effect that had on the non-mycorrhizal weeds. And he said in one of his trials he got a 90% reduction in growth, but he couldn't figure it out. But my guess is that under certain conditions, this mycorrhizal environment is very hostile to the non-mycorrhizal plants. This is all part of this changing the environment and using that. There are some traditional farming systems, in the East, there's a book called Farmers for 40 Centuries, where they have been able to create a farming system which is a cycle where your succession is just directed in a circle, where you're always preparing the soil to grow the next crop. When you have that situation, you're using the forces of nature and working with them instead of trying to oppose them. So the general principle that I came away with from all this is whenever we come into a problem that drives us crazy, we need to look at it as a symptom of an imbalanced biology, or of nature trying to take us in a different direction, trying to make the succession take us in a different direction than where we're trying to go. And we can use this and the symptoms of it for hints as to how to farm. So I'll give you a couple of quick examples. I know I'm running way over, or will be. Foxtail. When you have a flush of foxtail, and we talked about foxtail last night with a group, it's an indication that that soil probably would grow millet. If the soil is trying to grow foxtail, and I won't go into the details of what I think is going on, a similar plant is going to be well adapted to that environment. Of course, those two are the same species. And I found that works, that if I have a field that's really heavily infested with foxtail, I have a really good crop of millet growing there. If we have brassica weeds, and there are exceptions to everything, but it probably means that I could do well growing a brassica crop. It's a little counterintuitive, but it's worked. Today, we have a rotation on our farm that has about 20 species in it. It seems like the more diversity we build into the rotation, the stronger the whole system gets. And especially now with the challenges of climate change, where we really don't know what's the weather going to throw at us. We've got these real extremes in drought. We have extremes in heavy rains. We have extremes in temperature coming at times when it's not normal. So having a lot of different crops in the system builds in that extra resilience that can roll with the punches. And the stronger and healthier our plants are, the more resilient they are to the challenges of this unusual weather that we're getting. And by the way, soil health involves the ability to infiltrate water. It involves the resilience of the soil to extreme weather. So as the soil becomes healthier, it's able to absorb more water from the big rains. It's also able to hold more water to tide us through a severe drought. The diseases that we're being hit with are not as severe because soil health gives us the diversity in the root zone that helps these plants resist the abiotic stresses as well as the biotic stresses. It makes the whole system stronger. And we found that like 2016, they tell me here was a good year for no-till. In New York, we went from the 26th of May until the middle of July on under an inch of rain. And we finished out the summer from the 26th of May until into October on 3.5 inches. You know, that's pretty severe. Our winter grains made record crops that year. Corn wasn't great, but it all made a crop, even with that little rain. But because we had such a diversity of crops, it really didn't, it ended up being a very profitable year. You know, the corn was the only, corn and soybeans took a yield hit, but we actually had other crops that had a higher yield than normal. Another piece that we've added, and then I'll try to wrap up and take a few questions, is we've started double cropping, and we've added animals. So in order to get more diversity, we found crops like Sudan sorghum hybrid, especially the BMR Sudan sorghum, has the same cleaning effect in the soil. It gives off the gas and biofumigates the soil. We've also noticed you put it in hard ground, its roots loosen the soil, and they don't need the whole season. So that after a winter grain, we can shift to growing Sudan sorghum hybrid as about a 60-day crop and harvest that as a forage. And we now have a deal with 3 young farmers in the area that are certified organic dairy farmers. And we supply all of the feed to those farms in return for a percentage of their milk check. Incidentally, we get back all the manure. Or they get as much manure, we calculate what they need for their pastures to create a closed nutrient cycle. But we are able to sell forages that way without depleting our soil. And it's made a more resilient community, because these farmers would not have been able to start. They were young farmers. They were really hard workers. They were very talented. One of them is my nephew. He ran the first 1.5 years with a cell count now never going over 100,000. You know, his cows are very healthy, but he doesn't like to grow crops. So it's been really good for him to manage his pastures and know that he's going to have plenty of feed. But that relationship gives us the ability to diversify the farm and grow some of these short-term forage crops that break weed cycles, break disease cycles, break insect cycles, and build the soil up. Plus add a little bit of income. After our winter barley, we're planting pinot beans. So after taking a full crop of malting barley, we're getting a second very high value crop on the same land. And dry beans don't seem to need much water. In 2016, on that really meager amount of rain, we had pinot beans yielding about 1,200 pounds to the acre, which is not a record crop, but it's a very profitable crop. And this was after taking almost $800 worth of malting barley off the same fields. And we had virtually no weeds in that cycle of growing the second crop. The medium red clover that we have in our spelt will be harvested in the fall or the next spring as dairy feed. Now, I like alfalfa. It does a lot of good things, but I think it's very expensive to grow forage if it's the only crop you get. If we take a profitable crop of grains and then take the cover crop, which will yield up to 2 or 3 tons that fall yet, it's a lot cheaper to feed dairy cattle on that cover crop. Just like it's a lot cheaper to feed dairy cattle on the BMR sorghum Sudan that comes off as a second crop. And what we set our goal to is to be able to add an animal component to our farm without depleting the minerals in the cycle, but also to feed more, to produce more food. So that we're pretty sure that we're producing the same amount of primary food on our farm, and that by using the animals, we've increased the total food output without reducing what else we're doing. But it really adds to the resilience, and financial resilience, especially having access to those markets. So I'm sure the hook is already, I've been escaping it and dodging it here for a few minutes, but if there's time for questions, I'll stop. Okay, the question is how we terminated the mustard. We used a very shallow, we disced it and followed with a very shallow European plow, which is not plowing, that's a whole 4-hour talk, but it's not plowing like we do with an American moldboard. It's kind of turning the soil 90 degrees. It's inverting the top, but not the hole. But it closes the surface to allow that fumigation effect to take place. So the other, okay.
You talked a little bit about what this grain issue for Canada thistle or velvet wheat, foxtail. Do you have anything on ragweed?
Question is on ragweed. And I can make a few observations on ragweed. Are you talking about the horseweed or the common ragweed?
The giant.
Oh, the giant ragweed. Fortunately, I've had giant ragweed tried to immigrate to our farm from Ohio in some soybean seed that came, but it doesn't seem to be spreading. But I think that whole genus in general seems to respond to certain environmental cues, and I don't have enough experience with that particular pest to see, but the principle here is we need to observe any weed or any pest that we've got. The way to ask the right question is to observe it very closely. Look at where is it strongest in the field, where does it start, learn everything you can about it and see everything you can about it to start getting some hints as to what's favoring it. And then from that you can develop a strategy for eliminating it. One strategy that comes to mind right away if you've got horseweed is that if you can grow crops that mismatch its life cycle, you'll deny it the chance to keep spreading seed. I have noticed it makes a really big seed. It seems to be able to come from deep in the soil, which makes it different from most of our weeds, which have to germinate in the top ½ inch. I also have, I think leaving it on top doesn't work because from what I've seen and heard, rodents and worms and other creatures will pull the seeds into the ground and actually plant them. A lot of seeds are destroyed if they stay on the surface. This is another cultural practice. A reason to reduce tillage is that the ground beetles, the rodents, and a lot of the things on the surface of the soil will destroy the weed rain until you plow it under and then they're preserved. But that's, this particular species has a strategy to avoid that working against it, or at least to escape that. I'm going to throw out one more idea with some of these unusual crops that we've added. When we have extreme weather events, we noticed that, for instance, BMR sorghum Sudan doesn't even show drought after corn is fully curled up. It's just really resilient to dry weather. We've got C4 crops and C3 crops. The C4 crops have a different type of photosynthesis, but they're much more efficient in handling drought. They use water much more efficiently than others. We've got a farm where we have 12 months in the year. It helps if we have species during the winter that can make use of the warm spells and that will grow, like for instance, rye will grow at 36 or 37 degrees Fahrenheit. So, and a lot of other of our cool weather plants can grow at low temperature, and they're catching sunlight, they're producing root exudates, they're holding soil life, they're feeding soil life. Then when we get the extremes in the summer, when it's extremely hot and dry, there are other species that will do really well in those conditions when our cool weather species shut down or really suffer. This is another benefit of the biodiversity, is to try to always have things growing that are going to be adapted to the conditions at that time and extend our season, but also extend the amount of carbon that our farm is harvesting and the amount of sunlight that our farm is harvesting all year long. Thank you. I'm sure I've run way over.